I might not be able to stick around quite the entire time, but I definitely wanted to stay here to say hi to Gayle, if nothing else.
That sounds good. All right, well, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining. Super excited to have everybody here. Gayle, thank you for joining us.
Sure, thanks so much. Happy to be here.
Yeah, so I think the way that we'll do this kind of, as per usual, we'll do a couple kind of background questions, and then we'll open this up to kind of Q&A from the audience. So anybody who has questions, by the way, during the kind of the fireside chat, feel free to throw them in the chat dialogue, and then otherwise we'll kind of open it up and you guys can ask them by just unmuting yourself and asking questions. So, I'd love to get started, Gayle. I'd love to just kind of hear a little about, you and your background and kind of what led you to, writing, cracking the coding interview and all of that. So I guess, how did you discover computer science and kind of what brought you to writing that book?
So, I got involved with computer science. I started programming when I was 14, which is, on the early-ish side, though not as early as probably some people. But actually, my whole family's engineers. My mom's electrical engineer. My father, my grandmother actually was an engineer. So I have a very, very large amount of engineering blood in my family. So yeah, I fell in love with programming when I was 14, and then did computer science, bachelor's and master's at UPenn, and then went to Google for a while. And I was at Google during a time of relatively rapid growth. So I got sucked into a ton of interviewing, was on the hiring committee there, and kind of a lot of, I'd say several different paths in my life sort of came together. So, there's being at Google, doing a ton of interviewing there. That was kind of one piece. And then when I was in college, I did a lot of, I started TAing my sophomore year of college, and I found that I really enjoyed teaching, especially kind of the process of teaching, of taking a hard concept and breaking it down for people. I really enjoyed that. And then when I was at Google, I also had this website on the side around interview questions that at first wasn't terribly serious. It was just kind of a list of interview questions I was asked, and other people added to that. And that kind of grew a lot. And so all those things came together, and I started saying, oh, okay, wait, how do I get a little bit more serious about this little side project I have? And that eventually led me to write Cracking Coding Interview, and then expand that into a similar book for product managers with my awesome co-author, Jackie Bavaro. And then also Cracking Tech Career, and now actually working in a fourth book that's kind of a job, kind of career training guide for product managers.
That's awesome. Yeah, so I guess two questions there. One, that's really cool that your grandmother was an engineer. What was your grandmother engineering? What was that like?
She was I believe she was a mechanical engineer. So her story was she believe, I may have some facts wrong, but basic gist is she started off as a mechanical engineer, and then she had to transfer colleges for some reason, and new college didn't actually allow women in engineering. So she kind of ended up majoring in math, but pretty much did all the coursework in engineering, and then was an engineer after she graduated college.
That's awesome. Wow, what a story.
Yeah.
And then that's also really interesting that you said, so it kind of started off kind of like a blog, like a little bit of a side project. There's a lot of companies, it was even looking at kind of, AngelList's origin story, right? Just kind of a blog. And then now, they're managing like $2.5 billion in AUM. And it just feels like a lot of these kind of projects often starts just a little bit of writing online. I guess, when did you realize that you wanted to take this more seriously? And then what advice might you have for someone who wants to, write a little bit online? When do you know kind of if this is going somewhere? And what you did about it. Yeah.
It's a good question. And I think you're right that there are a lot of stories like this of, oh, I just had this little thing on the side that I'm not that serious about. And then it's like, oh my God, wait, hold on, this is real. And I think one of the major reasons why you see that is that there are just a lot of things on the side. Yes, I had something on the side that would happen to be an interview website. I had a few other things on the side that never turned anything. I can't even totally remember what they are.
Yeah.
But when you find something that fits a need, it can become quite clear that it fits a need.
Yep.
And when I got more serious about it, for a while I was kind of, this is back in the early days, maybe. And actually while I was at Google, I was kind of like, yeah, I should get more serious about this. And I'm like trying to make ads work. And I had this conversation with my old manager where he was like, so, how's that website going? I'm like, oh yeah, good. We're trying to, it wasn't a big thing. I was like, maybe I could pick up a little cash on the side. Yeah. He was like, he asked me point blank, he's like, so how much money do you make in ads every day? And I was like, oh, about $5. And he's like, yeah, so that's not working. And I'm like, yeah, but wait, hold on. If the traffic picks up, and he's like, no, that's not working. Like, even if your traffic picks up 100x, it's not going to make a difference in your life. Find something else.
Wow.
And I was like, oh, you're probably right. And I was like, okay, so how do I do a little better?
Yeah.
And, experimented with writing a, little PDF that I wasn't, was like, oh, let me just try this. And that was, first day, it was like, oh my gosh, that's what it looks like to find something that people really want. And then started developing that a lot more seriously.
So you kind of went blog to PDF to ultimately the book. When you had that PDF, how did you sort of launch that, or how did you let people know that you'd written that?
So I just launched it on Career Cup, which is, the website that kind of backs everything.
Right.
So I just kind of sold it there, set up some scripts that would, when people purchased, crawl my email and email a PDF to people. And, at first it wasn't actually anything particularly awesome, but people still seemed to really resonate with people. They liked it a lot, even though I look back and it's somewhat embarrassing. And, I kind of promised people from the beginning that, look, I'm going to keep developing this. And for the foreseeable future, when I develop come out with a new version, I'll send you the new update.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Great. So, so now that you've written that, you have another book in the works. This is kind of your full-time job. I'd love to hear just a little bit more about Career Cup. Is it kind of just the umbrella organization? What else do you all do there? How did you kind of go from engineer to now, entrepreneur?
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. Career Cup is sort of the umbrella organization that everything gets kind of funneled through. So there's kind of a couple major components of that. One is the website, which is can almost be thought of as lead gen. It's website, people post interview questions, people can respond to them. Website's totally free, and then but ends up being at this point basically lead gen to help sell, promote the book, promote other things. So the website's one piece of the business, though there's no direct income from that.
Got it.
Books are another piece. And I'm actually, it's not everybody knows, but I think I see somebody, Matthew Lewis, with the book in the background. You can see it's a real physical book.
There we go.
But I actually self-publish it. So I'm actually the publisher as well, which means that I actually get the money in the middle rather than it all going to the publisher. So the books are another big piece of it. So it's, I have work with printing presses and distribute around the world. And there's that whole mess of being a publisher that I have to deal with. And then another big piece is consulting. So I work with, sometimes it's startups going through acquisitions who hire me to help their engineers prepare for the interviews. But a lot of my consulting is working with larger companies, some smaller companies, and helping them create interviewer training programs, build out a hiring process, and getting a process that gets you, better signal, fewer false negatives, fewer false positives.
Yep. Awesome. I mean, I have a lot more questions, but I've been asking for a while now. So I think this would be a good time to kind of open it up. I see we have some fans with the book, and I know there's a few people who've messaged me who have some kind of specific questions for you. So yeah, if you have a question, I think we'll just kind of unmute yourself and ask it. And then you're also welcome to kind of ask in the chat, and then I'd be happy to ask that to Gayle. But yeah, if you have a question, why don't you unmute yourself and go ahead. Okay. Yeah,
I've got one. Yeah. Gayle, thanks so much again for joining us. I'm curious how the self-publishing experience has been. That seems like a lot to undertake while also simultaneously writing the book and doing all the promotion. So I'm curious, what have you learned through that process? And I know there's some writers around Contrary Talent also who might be able to take something away from that.
Yeah, I mean, it's been definitely really difficult at parts. One of the things that's been the most challenging is that there's a ton of stigma around self-publishing, which is why for a long time I would kind of try to hide it. Now I'm like, it's okay to actually admit that it's self-published. But it's definitely not something, when you're very early on, you want to advertise that you're self-published. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely been challenging. And what's been hard about it is that there is a ton of advice online about self-publishing, but it's just totally inapplicable not completely, but it's largely doesn't apply to the kind of things I'm doing. So the analogy I make is, it's like you're trying to start a tech startup, and everybody who's run companies, and everybody who and everybody you see online started talking about starting a company, they all started little restaurants. So, yeah, there's some parallels between a tech startup and a restaurant, but it's not really the same thing. And that's kind of where the self-publishing world has been historically and really still is. It's largely around people writing, vampire fiction type stuff, publishing only on Kindle that often has a really low quality bar, and you kind of know it's self-published. And meanwhile, I'm like, yeah, but I need to actually print real books and get them distributed in Barnes and Noble, and that's just a completely different ballgame. It's gotten a lot easier because now there's rules you have to follow, and I figured out what they are, where you have to distribute, where you have to post it, what rules you have to follow in order to post to get it distributed certain places. But a lot of it was trial and error. The other thing I did was for my, Cracking and Coding Interviews is my first book. For my second book, which was called The Google Resume and then got renamed to Cracking the Tech Career, I had a publisher who approached me, Wiley, which is one of the major publishers, approached me and actually pitched me on writing the book. And I took them up on that offer largely because I realized that this was in 2010, I think. I was like, I have something with Cracking the Coding Interview. I know I do, but I also feel like I'm stumbling in the dark here. And so I took their offer to write this book, mainly because I knew I would never make a whole lot of money through publisher. But mainly because I felt like I needed essentially to take their advice and translate it back to Cracking the Coding Interview. And so that was helpful, especially with figuring out how do you get a book translated into, simplified Chinese and then distributed elsewhere. So that was very helpful there.
Awesome. Yeah. And I guess a follow-up for this from the chat. So Luca's wondering, for someone wanting to go the self-publishing route, would you recommend trying to get into stores, going directly to Amazon, or some other approach? Are there any good resources to walk people through that process?
Yeah, so there's a number of Facebook groups around self-publishing. You have to realize that the quality of the people of the books in there are usually pretty low, but they can walk you through a lot of the mechanics of it. The reality is that getting in stores, I'll say this, when I applied to be in Barnes and Noble stores, Cracking Coding Interview was then and still is in the top 300, 500 books of all books on Amazon, right? So that is, when you think about how many books there are, that is phenomenally well. And yet Barnes & Noble repeatedly rejected me. They carry 10, 20, 30, I don't know how many. They carry a ton of books in their stores, and yet they're saying no to my book, which is clearly outsells the vast majority of books in their store. So kind of my thought to people is, look, if don't bother with Barnes & Noble. You're not going to get it until your book actually sells really well. They don't really like self-published books. Don't bother with it until you actually have a legitimate claim there. Focus on promoting your book. And you need to think about your book as a startup. And you can write an awesome piece of software. Doesn't mean anything if you don't have customers who want to buy it. And if you don't have a way of reaching out to those customers, focus on a promotion engine first. The book comes second.
Gotcha. Thanks so much.
Hey, Gayle. Nick here. Huge fan. I got both your books here.
Awesome.
And when I introduced myself in Contrary, I said I'm a wannabe Gayle McDowell because a book called Ace the Data Science Interview, which should be out in about 4 weeks. Self-publishing via Amazon. And also running a company in the career space. So it's kind of what I've been doing for the last 2 years. So huge fan. So I'm really excited to be able to talk to you. So, what I found interesting is I have a bunch of questions, but my first one would be like all this publisher stuff. Is this just because you want to increase your margin? Like it seems like a ton of work. Is it just because of how popular the book has gotten? It's worth your time investment to be the publisher itself?
Yeah, it's so I'd say the simplest answer is it is entirely about the margins. If my margins were somehow better with a publisher, which they wouldn't be, then I'd go with a publisher, but it's entirely about the margins. There are some other benefits of not going through a publisher, which is about control. So, I said that I wrote the Google resume with, partnering, or had, publisher approached me to write it. And I took that mainly to basically steal their advice and use it for the book I cared more about. And I found with that first experience, I thought they were great. The second time I came around and I'd come out with a new edition, I'm like, ooh, actually, I don't know if I agree with some of their advice anymore. Now I have all this more information. They may know more about publishing than me, but I know my audience better. And I still have a lot of respect for the publisher, don't get me wrong. I think they did a good job. But one of the benefits of self-publishing and one of the trade-offs is that you have a lot of control here and you have the ability to shoot yourself in the foot. But you also have the ability to do what's right for your audience, when a publisher may be doing what they think is on average right for an average book, but doesn't mean that they know your audience. So there's that little piece, but yeah, pretty much the margins. Got it.
No, that makes a ton of sense. And then speaking of margin, right? So I've told a bunch of my friends, oh, I'm writing a book right now. And they're like, well, look at the margins on tech, or like making a tech company, or look at the margins on just simply making an online course. Courses are really popular. I want to hear about, like, why are you writing a fourth book rather than doing a course?
Ron, you have kids approaching about 2 seconds. Go on. There we go.
Oh, that's cute.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
Yes, Tobin. What's that?
Mom, can I have raisin bran?
Sure. Go downstairs, okay? I'm on a call. Sorry about that. Go on.
Just to repeat the question, it's what do you think about courses? Why are you not making a course? And why are you writing a fourth book, basically?
Course has always been in the back of my mind. There's a lot of people doing courses right now. I might do it one day. I definitely don't rule it out. It's not something I feel like I absolutely need to prioritize right now. Maybe I'll do it down the road, but it's not like I think courses are a bad idea. It's just one of those things that just I'm busy with some other things. That's not at the top of my list. And then you had a second part of that question that I forgot.
Yeah. So I guess, and then I guess that's why not to a course, but then why write a fourth book rather than do more consulting, or make, double down on some of the Career Cup stuff and make more of a services company that scales this up? Like, why write a fourth book, basically?
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of need for it, and hopefully need translates into demand. But my fourth book is sort of the vision of my fourth book, which should be called Cracking a PM Career. This is going to be the book that hiring managers give the PMs they just hired, whether fresh out of college or a lot more experience, or that they go by themselves when they're like, what do I do? How do I be a PM? Or how do I be a better PM? There are a lot of questions around that. There's a lot of people enter this profession of product management. They're like, it's this weird field where there isn't clear advice, and it's a whole smattering of read this. So we're like, I think we can be the book that the go-to book there. It's actually something which I know product management interviewing very well. I know book writing very well. I am not the right person to solely independently write a book on how to be a great product manager. So that's something that my co-author, Jackie Bavaro, is doing the kind of the heavy lifting here. And I'm doing a lot of the editing and refining it into a great polished product.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks.
As somebody who's super passionate about talent acquisition and doing it better, and thinks that there is a very large amount of improvement to happen in that space, generally speaking, what did user research look like for writing the book? And not just like speaking things that are true, but doing so in a way that's accessible to people, that is going to be impactful and really move the needle on somebody's ability to perform well in an interview, or on the other end of the spectrum, somebody working in talent acquisition's ability to construct an interview that actually tests for the things that they want to test for.
Yeah, so I think cracking the coding interview, I know when I started writing it, I knew this space really well. I'd done many interviews. I'd prepared a bunch of people. I think I'm a little bit of a natural teacher in a way, or at least I had a lot of experience teaching, and I feel like I'm pretty good at it. So I think it's a lot of it.
So. I agree.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think it comes relatively easily to me in that sense. And again, I like in college, I was a TA for 3 or 4 years on a subject that it wasn't the algorithms class, but it was like Penn's class that was called Mathematical Foundation of Computer Science. That it was a lot of kind of algorithm and concept stuff. So a lot of it just applied indirectly to this. So I think a lot of it came kind of naturally to me. And then Cracking the Code interview is written very iteratively. You know, people always ask me like, how long did it take you to write it? I'm like, I don't know, like the first PDF, a couple weeks. But there was like 2 years between the PDF and a physical book. So it was a very iterative thing, and I'm constantly getting feedback on it. And then the other big piece of it has been doing consulting, and especially doing both sides. So helping candidates. One of the things that's I think been the most informative is not just doing mock interviews and helping people prepare, but the context I do a lot of that nowadays is, and for the past few years, usually I don't work with candidates directly. I usually work with startups going through acquisitions. And what that's allowed me to do is interview the same person repeatedly. And it gives a very different perspective than when you interview one person, you know, when you interview each person once. When you interview the same person repeatedly, you see the anomalies where one very concrete thing I learned is that applies to both when I'm doing interview prep as well as helping create interview processes is questions on memoization. That's memoization, not memorization, memoization. So the concept of dynamic programming and caching data, things like that. I learned that these actually, and I'm going to make some people mad when I say this, these actually make pretty bad interview questions, it turns out. They are, when I prepare somebody, they're one of the first things I prepare people on. I'm like, go do 10 of these questions, and you'll become much better at these questions, more so than really any other type of interview question. And what that means is that for candidates, go prepare those. There's a really good sort of bang for your buck in terms of prep time. And for companies, it means don't ask those questions. You're heavily evaluating how much someone prepared rather than how good they actually are. And so there's a lot of sort of a feedback loop that goes in there when I'm working with candidates.
So to expand on that a little bit, I feel like as a recruiter, it is very heavily my job to make sure that we are not testing for the skill that is being good at interviewing, but like the actual job that we want people to do. And seeing, I forget where it came out of, but studies coming out especially recently about like the actual on-site interview tests if somebody is good under pressure, but not if they can do the job that you want them to do, which is, unless you're, a high stakes SRE, probably not performing very well under pressure and is probably like actually thinking very methodically about things over a long period of time. I find that there's not many tools in my arsenal to really validate that I'm testing the things that I want to test for. Like, if you're to think of like a meaningful data set on like trying to tie first performance review to what their performance was in the interview, like to get to 100 full stack engineers, which is probably about the size of data set that you need to be meaningful insights. That's a pretty big company at that point, having made 100 hires and like probably starting to have recorded that at like series B.
And even then, that's not many data points.
It's really not. I mean, really, you should be going for about 1,000 for that to be an actual meaningful, like, can do actual data science on it. And there's ways that I've found to like try to back into that of like a new hire NPS of like asking the hiring manager and the new hire how good a fit they think they are after 90 days. But what techniques have you seen to validate that you're actually testing for the skills that you want to test for instead of just testing for the the skill of interviewing? Because I've only really been able to do that in like a debrief when I'm sitting down with everybody and like trying to dig into somebody's answer to try to figure out like, okay, no, that person was actually just nervous. but that's not exactly a scalable playbook.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right that you're going to have some real problems with the site. If you try to study this yourself, you're going to have some real data set problems here. Google tried, and they got a lot of press about their, studies that they did on interviewing. But it's kind of worth noting that, the press on it was, oh, interviews weren't predictive at all of real world job performance. And yet, like, let's take a step back, guys. They didn't actually change anything after this. So maybe that should tell us that maybe their data didn't really look like how it's getting reported. Because the reality is that no company is willing to, one, hire a ton of people and then actually try to do a real study on this. So actually try to say, okay, let's hire a bunch of these people and like not really interview them, and then hire a bunch of these people and use our normal interview process on them and then see what happens. Like, nobody's willing to do that experiment, and Google didn't do that experiment either. So what Google tried to do is see, of the people who got hired, who realistically, the people who got hired were probably scoring on average between like a 3.0 and a 3.2 out of 4 on average. We're talking about a really, really narrow range. And so we're asking, does that then correlate? Does whether someone has a 3.0 or 3.2 correlate with their job performance? Like, they just didn't really have enough information. And then the scores themselves are not actually reflective perfectly of how someone did in the interview, because someone can be a harsher grader and easier grader. So like, even Google, who has a ton of data, more data than you'll probably get, couldn't study this. So my simple answer is I kind of think you're a little bit screwed here. And I think, yeah. Everybody asks me like, so what data do you have? I'm like, I don't think we can really get data very easily. There was that study you mentioned that concluded theoretically that interviews are primarily measuring how someone reacts under pressure. And as I recall, how this study was done was they compared the results of people. It was a semi-randomized study, I believe, but they compared the results of people who were interviewed with somebody in the room and someone who wasn't, who was interviewed with somebody not in the room. And the people who were interviewed with somebody else in the room did worse.
Yes.
But keep in mind, and so yes, the pressure probably made them feel worse. I don't doubt that. But the person who was in the room in the other group didn't do anything. They were just sitting there observing. It was not actually equivalent to what happens hopefully in a software engineering interview process, where the interviewer is interacting and coaching and helping. So all we're really finding is having someone just silently, creepily watching you makes you kind of nervous. Like, yeah, well, of course it does. What are you going to expect? It makes no difference. It makes someone do better to have someone creepily watching them, not doing anything, not helping, just watching. Of course they do worse.
Sure.
That's, this isn't that informative, really. Sure. So I think, my best advice to you is, look, I would love to have data. I wish we did. I think the most compelling piece of information to me is the fact that if you've done a lot of interviews, that there's a whole lot of people who you're like, ooh, wow, really? Like, yes. Where we know that if we've done a lot of interviews. And from there, I can say, look, I don't think a randomly hired group of people who interview with Google could build Google. Or could build basically every single tech company has been built with this interview process. I cannot believe that it's realistic that hiring at random would have had those same kind of results. It does, which does not mean that this process isn't terribly flawed. I think there's a lot of problems. I think there's a lot of particularly false negatives. But when people say it's totally broken and doesn't work, I'm like, it's definitely flawed, but broken completely, doesn't work at all. I can't believe that random people could build Google.
Yeah, that I definitely agree with. Yeah.
Let me just jump in I'll say one other thing here is my best advice is, if you can get data, awesome. I haven't seen anyone really get great data here. You can, without data, you can still do the best job you can to do the best job you can. So, you can do things to increase transparency about what is going to happen. We can analyze this realistically and say, I think candidates you're going to have see fewer false negatives if you make the process transparent so that people, especially women and minorities who may not have the social network and the kind of peer network to prepare them for interviews, so they know what they're going to get going into it. That's probably going to be a good thing for your interviews. Making sure that the people on your team who, regardless of how they are deep down, the people on your team who don't come off as friendly, just don't have them interview. It's just not, it's just not something you want to do. It doesn't matter how nice of the person they are deep down. If they seem unfriendly, don't have them interview. That's probably going to be bad for your candidates if you have unfriendly people interviewing.
That is extremely consistent with my experience, especially for
make sure interviewers are trained. You know, I think there's a lot we can do to create the best process, use our gut instincts in terms of like, without having data, but our gut instincts in terms of what helps our good interview process, do the best job you can there, even though unfortunately, we probably won't have great data for a long time on this.
Well, fingers crossed. At Triple Byte, we had about 30,000 interviews worth of data, and we managed to double the average on-site to offer ratio from about 20% to about 40%.
Yeah.
So maybe there will be data someday. I would like to hope that we can potentially solve this problem someday, because it feels like a significant problem to solve, especially in my life in talent acquisition.
I mean, I think we do have data that of various forms that we can help people do better in interviews. So, you know, I was doing for several years, Facebook had me do a talk 2 nights a week, same talk over and over and over again, week after week, the exact same talk to a different pool of candidates every time. Helping, just saying, hey, here's what the process is about, here's how to prepare, here's what, you know, here's some advice for you. And they saw data that, yes, this was actually making a meaningful impact on how people did in interviews. Does not mean that interviewing works. In fact, if anything, it slightly tips the scale towards it being less effective. But it's nonetheless a good thing to do for candidates. So we have data there, but yeah, I think the data on does this process work more effectively than something else, I think is much harder to get really concrete data on.
I very much agree. I do have to duck out. I'll let Zach continue things going on. See you guys.
If other people have questions, just unmute yourself and ask away.
Sorry, I didn't understand that story. Facebook was hiring you to give a talk to their candidates who were interviewing at Facebook?
Yep, you got it. So the idea here is that false negatives, so candidates who would be actually good employees but interview poorly, you want to reduce those. And they felt like there was a particularly big issue, or at least they were particularly focused on hiring people who had more experience. And often people who have more experience are less sort of in the loop about this is what interviewing is.
Right.
And so Facebook had me come in 2 nights a week to do a talk to some people in person and a lot of people just online to get about 70 candidates 2 times a week. Same talk every time, so different pool of candidates every time, to get them ready. And they found that it actually made a meaningful dent in candidates doing better in interviews. And the more that candidates do better in interviews, the more that you're leveling the playing field.
Yeah.
Because you're not making someone smarter or like, and if you are, awesome, right? But someone isn't cheating because they listened to me talk for an hour and a half about how to do interview. What they're doing is reducing the people who do poorly for reasons that are not meaningful.
Sure, that makes a ton of sense. I guess speaking of that, right, this is like a corporate engagement. How did you decide, your book's such a bestseller, like why consult? Is it the money is good? Is it because you love it? Because, I would think, if your book's one of these top 300 on Amazon, you're a self-publisher, why are you going and helping a 5-person startup? I think you helped my friend's company, Sendbloom, Ross Epstein. I was surprised to hear that because I was like, wait, Gayle, the book one, he's helping out you. So I'm just curious about that.
Yeah. So, money, this is, I hate to give a crude answer, but this is my job. This is how I pay for kids' tuition and stuff like that. Right. It's my job and I do it for money. most of my consulting is more for bigger tech companies. And then I'll take the kind of acquisition stuff, bigger tech companies, or I'll say this, most of my consulting is on the side of here's how to create a good interview process, and let me start training your engineers and set up a for the biggest company, set up a train the trainer program. So that's most of my consulting. And then the acquisition stuff, I don't actively promote, but when it falls into my lap through referral, which is pretty often, I'll have it kind of, if I'm available, fill in the cracks of time I have.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. Cool, thanks.
I have a quick question. Just because, I mean, you've seen so many thousands and thousands of interviews over the past couple of years. Do you see any shift in the way that interviews are being given? I mean, like, I guess like the technical classic interview, like you said, has kind of been like the bread and butter for all these big tech companies for the past little while. And I've seen some shifts, like I've seen, I guess, like given bigger projects instead of like the 20, 30-minute little coding exercises. But I mean, just like, have you seen anything that's like starting to take off, or do you think that there's a better solution out there that could be taking off anytime soon? Just I think a lot of the people here are looking to start something at some point, and I guess interviews are the biggest, most important factor when building a team.
Yeah, so I think there's been shifts in the hire. There's been some expected shifts that are not terribly interesting. So over the past 5, 10, 15 years, so it's been a shift in what languages people tend to use for interviews. C is a lot less common nowadays for a standard software engineer. Even C++ is much less common than it was 15 years ago. Python's a whole lot more common now than it was 15 years ago. So some obvious shifts there. Some relatively obvious shifts with, now versus 5, 10, 15 years ago. Kind of as time goes on, you're going to see more shift towards, well, it's possibly capped out now, but you're going to see, more interviewing around system architecture and things like that, right? Not terribly shocking, right? Those aren't the kind of interesting shifts that happen. There's a set of companies now that are playing around with, maybe we should give people projects, maybe we should do this or that. It's a different set of companies that are playing with it now than were playing with it 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15, et cetera. But there's always been a pool of companies that are doing that. In fact, if anything, although there's been a lot more talk of how else can we interview, how can we do something better, I think there's actually been more standardization on this process than there was 10, 15 years ago. So I'd say, for the most part, I don't think the industry has dramatically changed. I think the biggest shift has been that, when I joined Google in 2005, and back then there was a bit of almost hostility around interview prep, where it was it was perceived a little bit more as, is interview prep cheating the process? And now I think there's, and it wasn't, I'm not saying everybody felt like it was, but there wasn't widespread acceptance of interview prep. Whereas now I think the industry has moved, and tech companies have moved towards pretty widespread acceptance and encouraging of interview prep. Nowadays, someone might say, I'd love to interview, give me 2 or 3 weeks to prepare. Sometimes people even ask for more than that. And I think in 2005, you wouldn't have seen that as much. So I think that's the biggest shift. And companies have started giving out resources. Sometimes, sometimes that's as relatively extreme as Facebook having me, talk 2 nights a week. But a lot of companies now have documents that they provide around interview prep. And so that's been, I think, the biggest shift.
Awesome. Thank you.
I had a question regarding the use of solely technical interview questions in software engineering interviews. During a lot of my experience interviewing for software engineering roles, a lot of my interviewers wouldn't even ask one behavioral question. It would just be purely coding questions. Whereas now when I'm interviewing for PM roles, there's definitely more of a behavioral component. Yeah. Do you think that's intentional? Is there because I always thought the interviewer getting to know me would be beneficial, and I kind of didn't like that there was no behavioral questions. But I'm wondering, is that just more efficient on the part of the company, or is that a result of company culture? What's the insight behind not having any of those questions for engineering?
Yeah, good question. My simple answer is some companies kind of suck. Some interviewers kind of suck. I mean, think of it as like if I took a whole bunch of engineers and I said, hey guys, go create a marketing plan. Like they're going to make a lot of mistakes, right? They're going to kind of maybe sort of stumble themselves to something competent, but there's going to be a lot of bad stuff that happens when you throw a bunch of engineers completely untrained into creating a marketing plan. And that's kind of what's happening with interview processes. In a lot of cases, it's engineers coming up with interview processes or recruiters, neither of which are really well suited to create engineering hiring processes. And engineers interviewing with really very little competent training. And so they do stupid things like not doing behavioral questions. I do think that my kind of quick summary of the software engineering hiring processes is I do think kind of the coding algorithm questions, when a company follows best practices, which many don't, but when they kind of do the right things, they do a reasonably good job of finding people who are pretty bright. And that I think is actually a pretty important thing to do, is hire people. If you're hiring, software engineering is it's an industry that depends so much on thinking. Hiring people who can think well is actually pretty important. So the questions do a pretty good job of that, but they miss a heck of a lot of stuff along the way. So it is important that companies ask behavioral questions. I think actually one of the biggest values of making sure you ask behavioral questions for a new grad is because when you don't, the candidates tend not to like you very much. And you have to create a good candidate experience or people aren't going to take your offers. At least the people who have other options aren't going to take your option when they don't like you. So it is really important to ask behavioral questions, and any company which isn't doing that, it doesn't make them an incompetent company. It just means they don't really know much about interviewing. And you're gonna, if you interview with enough companies, you're gonna find some companies which don't do that. I will say that I think you need to ask behavioral questions in order to give a good candidate experience. I think behavioral questions are also really important as someone develops more experience to really kind of figure out what they've done and accomplished. If you want to figure out how well somebody can work with people, I don't know that behavioral questions do that good of a job. I think they do a good job of figuring out how well somebody can talk about their prior experience, not necessarily actually how collaborative they are. I find that I get a pretty good impression of what it's like to work with somebody by actually asking them a coding question and participating with them and helping them and coaching them and giving them feedback. And that's in a lot of ways the best signal I get on collaboration and interpersonal skills. But you still need to be asking behavioral questions because people don't like it when you don't.
Okay. And I guess following up on that, do you have any good questions for interviewees to ask to get a sense for company culture and to see if they're a good fit for the company?
Yeah, great question. So I'm going to give advice that's a little bit non-traditional. You hear a lot of people say interviewing is a two-way street, and I think that's misguided. I don't think interviewing is really a two-way street. It's a one-way street, and then the street heads the other direction. It is not actually a two-way street. And so what I mean by that is that when you are interviewing with a company, particularly when you're already in kind of the final interviews, at this point, you've kind of already committed your time. It doesn't really matter at that point in time what you think of the company. Focus on getting the offer. Once you have an offer, you have some time to actually go and talk to your future teammates, talk with your manager, talk with other people at the company, and use that time to get a sense for company culture. But when you're in the interview itself, just focus on the offer. You can how much you like the company is really important. It's incredibly important. I'm just saying, put that after the offer. And that I think actually ends up releasing some of the pressure for candidates, because now you don't need to try to figure out information without turning a company off. Just focus on the offer, ask questions for the sake of asking questions, because companies don't like it when you don't. Ask questions about the interesting challenges, what the launch process is like, stuff that makes you seem curious or engaged about the company and the product, but ask questions because it makes you look good. And after you have the offer, then you can do more of a kind of deep dive into, do you actually really, really want to work there?
Okay, that's super helpful. Thank you.
I'm curious. So I'm a software engineer turned marketer. I always love hearing about distribution. How did you sell your first 100 books, 1,000 books, and 10,000 books?
So as I said, I started selling Cracking the Coding Interview from Career Cup, the website, and it was just sold as a PDF first. So yeah, I mean, I just kind of put the link up there and they sold. There's a whole lot more magic than that. Yeah, I mean, it just kind of sold from there. And then when I eventually turned it into a physical book, I think I had it as a PDF and a physical book for a while, and people got the option of either buying on Amazon or buying the PDF, and there was already a pretty strong word of mouth effect there. Feedback was already strong. People. I never ever engaged in any of the kind of fake review game that a lot of people play with, which is very dangerous, by the way. I was sort of lucky in a way in that the book was already popular by the time it actually showed up on Amazon, and so word of mouth was really big. Word of mouth, and then just the Career Cup website. So
I guess then, how did it sell when it was in its initial PDF days? Is it just like organic traffic through SEO to Career Cup?
Not even that much SEO. I mean, it had a lot of traffic. Word of mouth. People probably emailed the website to their friends. But the Career Cup website predated the book by probably several years, so it had plenty of traffic by the time any form of the book came out.
And was that traffic to Career Cup just, again, organic word of mouth stuff, or did you do stuff? I'm like a growth engineer, so I'm just like really curious, skeptical when things just grow. I hate to reject you here, but I mean, I know I've played around and done some stuff with ads and things like that. I read a little bit about, on the title page for each web page, rather than just having the name of the interview question, put Google interview question, because sometimes people Google interview questions, right? So some basic stuff like that, but which I'm sure probably did help. I did play around with ads. I don't know that ads were ever particularly profitable when you break it all down. I've done Facebook ads in the past for the book. I don't think it actually paid off. So I mean, it was really, really close. As I recall, it was like very, very close to break even. I mean, honestly, I think I hit something with a really strong product market fit and never had to focus that much on how do I optimize a zillion little things. I love it. Yeah, that makes sense.
Matt, you want to go ahead? Yeah.
Hey, Gayle. My name's Matt. Thanks for joining us. I was wondering, could you tell us about the best candidate you ever interviewed and what stuck out about them, if you can think of one? Yeah,
I mean, I remember, so at a technical level, I remember one candidate when I was at Google, where I was flown out to, and Google was setting up an office in Moscow, and I was flown out to Moscow, and Google really tried to have a policy of not sending any candidate home early, which is, by the way, a very good policy. I strongly encourage it at companies, because sending a candidate home early tends to, even though I think in the vast majority of cases it's a fair decision, that when you get to the point of like, this candidate is so bad, I want to send them home early, like they probably really are not going to get an offer, and you probably could save yourself time, but it really pisses off the candidate, which then they go and bad mouth to everybody. So Google had this policy of, we do not send a candidate home early. And so I remember, we were doing these interviews in Moscow, and these were kind of batch interviews. So we interview hour after hour, one candidate after another. And there was a candidate who actually was not actually on my initial slate, but I was brought in to interview him because basically everybody else had interviewed him and had asked him all of their hardest questions. And this guy was just like whizzing through every single one. And they're like, we literally need to waste this guy's time, which is stupid. At that point, just send him home early. But It was like, we cannot send him home early, so we need just more interviewers in there. And yeah, I mean, he just whizzed through every question I got. So at a technical level, I mean, he was phenomenal. But I'd say, you know, a more interesting answer is the kinds of candidates who there's candidates who are just absolutely brilliant, like him, and many other people who are very, 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 very smart, solve questions that they have never seen before very quickly. And that's awesome at a technical level. The people who I enjoy interviewing the most are the ones who seem excited about solving hard problems. Who, you know, you ask them questions, they're like, "Ooh, that's a good one," and you can see they're actually enthusiastic about solving the questions. And those people who I find are the most fun. And I think it's ultimately it's a good trait in an engineer also to have somebody who likes to solve hard problems. And so that's kind of what I'd encourage you all to think about is, if you like solving hard problems, show that to the interviewer. Show that side of you. Show the side of you that not only is eager and enjoys solving hard problems, but is also willing to solve hard problems. To be contrasted with the candidates who get a hard problem, don't know the answer, which, by the way, you aren't supposed to know the answers, and then just kind of are like, I don't know, and they kind of give up. That's the person you do not want to be. Be the one who's eager and willing to solve hard problems.
Thank you. I think we have another question in the chat.
Matt, do you want to just read that one out loud?
Yeah. It says, what kind of projects do you believe make a candidate more likely to get noticed and offered a coding interview or next round? Especially for most internship positions, are they looking for front-end examples, back-end examples, etc.?
Good question. So the projects that are going to help you the most are the ones that are relevant to the jobs you're looking for, which is kind of a stupid, obvious answer. So if you want to get a front-end job, a job that's heavy on, you know, front-end stuff is going to be better. If you want a back-end job, a back-end, you know, project that's heavy on the back end and uses a lot of back-end services is going to be helpful. But what I also want to add with that is think about the companies kind of related to, it helps you to do a project vaguely related to the thing you're going to be working on, which does not mean the product you're working on as much as the skills. So front-end projects help, back-end projects help. If it's a company related to that, if it's a company that seems to value and appreciate open source projects can help. But I also think it's really interviewer dependent. I personally have a small bias towards independent projects as opposed to open source. You know, open source where you're working on, you know, a large code base, solely because what I care about at the end of the day is this is a person who can code and ideally likes to code. Though I don't expect everyone to be coding in their free time. And the reason why I have a small bias towards independent projects is that it's much easier for me to measure. When you've done an independent project, I know that everything was you, and there's not as much ambiguity over, yeah, but did you do this? Did you really do this hard piece? When it's a big open source project and you contributed to this thing, I'm like, yeah, but so what? It's so much more unclear what was really you. So I personally have a small bias for independent projects just because I can understand what you did better. But other interviewers are just really emphatic about open source. Others are really emphatic about mobile apps. So there's a lot of kind of randomness here with what that interviewer likes. Some really like research projects. I tend to be a little bit not anti-research, but less pro-research because it's just so much harder to measure. I know that when I was in college, there are quite a few people who I knew were not very good developers, who were not particularly brilliant, and yet were doing really cool research, which really meant that they were working under a professor doing some relatively menial thing while the professor did all the actual hard work. And it looks impressive what they did, but it really wasn't them. And so research is always a little bit, it's just harder for me to understand what you actually did. But that's my personal bias. Other interviewers really like research, and research might also be really, really applicable to, certain types of jobs. So it just depends on where you're looking.
I think a quick follow-up would be, when you talked about resumes on your site, it says like it's a very quick, I'm glancing at your resume, I'm looking for a few things. As a interviewer, did you see the project and go try to look at it more, or did you try to see how they described it?
Usually I wouldn't go and look up the website, the website of the project online. I mean, sometimes that usually wouldn't be, usually when I'm screening resumes, it's like, I don't have the time to, when I'm screening resume, generally speaking, the only decision I have to make is interview or don't interview. I don't have to evaluate just how strongly do I want to interview them. So if I'm getting to the point of, hey, I wonder what this project was, let me go look it up online, it's probably already wound up in the yes pile, and it's not a good use of my time at that point in time to go look it up. However, when I'm actually interviewing somebody, I might go then and look up the project. It's just, in the resume screening process itself, I can't spend 5 minutes on a resume. I'm spending realistically 10, 15, 20 seconds on the resume. Because the only decision I'm making is interview or don't interview.
Thanks again.
Awesome. All right. If anybody has maybe one more question, we can probably do one more and then we'll wrap things up. Is there any kind of final questions someone's been wanting to ask, especially if you haven't spoken yet and want to ask one?
Hi. So I just want to follow up on Nick's question a few questions back. What were the factors that led word of mouth to take off for you? I think you hinted at this a little bit by saying product market fit, but I was wondering if you could dig into that a bit more, including whether or not you tried to consciously build that growth through word of mouth or engineering.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think I've been very conscious. So I'd say I believe strongly in ethics behind running a company, and doing the right thing for candidates. And so that's always been it's not even a business strategy, although I think it is beneficial in the business in the long run, but it's just something I just strongly believe in being honest. There are things I could have done at times to make my book more successful. So for example, people have pushed in the past to be like, you should have a ton of questions about this or this or this or this algorithm. And I'm like, but that's not being, I know you think you want that, but companies aren't actually asking this stuff. And so I've always had at the top of my mind, do the thing that's right for candidates, and not necessarily the thing that will help me, and not necessarily the thing that they're always asking for. And I think ultimately that's a good thing, even though in the short term it can often feel tempting. But yeah, I mean, that's been just that's just kind of a deeper down personality thing that I really value, integrity and honesty. And I think I had a lot of experience teaching and interviewing and hiring and seeing the sorts of things people were struggling with. And then taking all those things I'd learned, and then book writing was a very iterative process. The first PDF was 20 pages and kind of sucked. People still liked it, and when I look back on it, I still think it kind of sucked. But so it was very iterative, and I kind of knew what would help people, and I worked towards that regardless of always what people were asking for.
All right, thank you.
Awesome. All right, everybody. Well, it's 6 p.m. now. Gayle, thank you so much for taking the time to join us tonight. We really appreciate it.
Sure. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody. We'll put the recording up, and we'll talk to you later.
Thank you.
Thank you.